We're losing tens of billions of dollars for shareholders and taxpayers.
Next up, Valdosta, Georgia. Scott on our line for Independence.
Hey, how you doing? I'm calling in on the Republican line, but
I'm sorry.
You could probably call me an independent because I feel like the party left me behind.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel that way too. But go ahead.
On the health care issue, number one, it seems to me like the government's already paying for a lot of people's health care. When you look at the military, government employees, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing, they're already paying for 60% of the people, so what would be the problem with picking up the rest of the tab? And let me make another point on the tax thing. This thing always just really bothers me, because everybody on there talks about taxes, and what they really mean is income taxes and capital gains taxes. When it's tax on anything else, gasoline sales tax, blah, 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 my utility bill, my phone bill, my gas bill, all those taxes are going up. And for people who don't have a big income, they're really getting eat up with the taxes. And the people at the top are paying all the income tax because they're making all the income.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point. And by the way, you know, I get frustrated with all these fees and taxes, and, you know, we just wrote at the Wall Street Journal about how states, I mean, this gentleman is exactly right, states, which are in tough financial times right now, are raising all sorts of, I mean, they're raising their income taxes, their sales taxes, their fishing license taxes. In Oregon, my favorite story is Oregon is raising their beer tax, Rob, by 1,900%. So I certainly empathize with you. I think government is way too big, it taxes way too much, and we've got to get government spending under control, not just in Washington. We got to get government spending control in the states. We just gave the states hundreds of billions of dollars in the stimulus plan, and instead of saving that money and using it so they wouldn't have to raise taxes, the state lawmakers ran out and spent all that money, and now they're raising taxes at the same time, so you're paying twice. You're paying at the federal level for the stimulus, and then you're paying more taxes at the state level. So I certainly agree with you. The taxes are way too high.
Our next call for Stephen Moore comes from Gerald in Timberland City.
Yes, I'm standing here with the 1932 tax, income tax, and a guy making $500,000 back then paid in $293,000 in taxes, and you just said the highest it's ever been is 40%. This is 61%, and I wonder where you come from, and the world has survived since then. So the other part about this is competitiveness.
Mm-hmm.
You guys think that we ought to all get 3 or 4 families to a house, somebody crawl out of the box like I've seen them do down in Mexico? Is this what you mean by competitiveness? You make me sick when we talk about competitiveness.
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're right. Throughout our history, in fact, our book, The End of Prosperity, is exactly about that. It kind of reviews, Rob, the history of the U.S. income tax system. And we do talk about, you know, back when the income tax first came into existence, was back in around 1916. The first income tax rate was 7%. And at that time, there was a big debate in Congress about maybe having a cap at 10%. And they argued, the people argued against it, saying, no, we'd never have a 10% income tax. We don't need to have that. And this gentleman's right. The income tax in World War I went up to, I think, around 75%. And then in World War II, it went up to, well, and then in the 1920s, we actually cut the income tax, and we had the Roaring 20s. And then, unfortunately, Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt raised the income tax to as high as 75%, which had a big impact on that horrible Great Depression that we had. They raised taxes in that era. And then this gentleman is right. In World War II, the income tax went up to, I believe, as high as 91%. And that income tax rate remained in effect until the early 1960s. People forget that it was John F. Kennedy who came in and sounded very much like Ronald Reagan and saying, you know, we have to cut tax rates to make our economy grow faster. We cut the top tax rate from 90 to 70%, and then in the 80s we cut the top tax rate from 70 to 28%. I just really believe, sir, we cannot compete on a global scale if we have the highest income taxes in the world. In the early 80s we had the lowest income taxes, and we had a great spurt of growth. I just don't think we're going to grow this economy if we're taking more out of the economy in taxes than other countries.
James Allen in Euless, Texas writes, Mr. Moore just repeated the myth about Reagan's tax cuts. In fact, he says, After cutting marginal rates in 1981, Reagan raised taxes twice, in 1982 and then each year thereafter from 1982 through 1987.
Yeah, I've always confused whether people, look, Ronald Reagan cut taxes, there's no doubt about it. I mean, when Reagan came in, the highest tax rate was 70%. Rates came down across the board. Now, it is true what happened, Rob, was we had a gigantic tax cut in 1981. People became concerned about the budget deficit, and they actually raised taxes in 1982, but it was only about a third. The tax increase was only about as big as the tax cut was. If you look across the board, tax rates came down in that period, and it was one of America's greatest periods of prosperity, and it was also a period when we got out of the worst period for the U.S. economy since the Great Depression in the 1970s, when we had, 14% inflation rates, we had 20% mortgage interest rates, we had gasoline lines. I mean, the 1970s was the worst decade since the 1930s for the U.S. economy. And Reagan, I think, through his tax budget policies and through his deregulatory policies, really helped pull us out of that terrible economic calamity.
Our next call for Stephen Moore comes from Lois in Deerfield Beach, Florida.
I am so angry that I hardly know where to start. This man really he belongs on K Street. And also I'd like to say he's with, look at him now, he's with the Wall Street Journal. Where was he when Bush was spending all the money? I never saw Wall Street Journal ever once complain. And have you noticed that whenever anybody asks him a question, he totally ignores that and goes into something else. Now, last comment is that when 5% of the people in this country control 90%, yeah, look at him scratching his ear. Oh, my God, she's right. What am I going to do? When 5% of the people in this country control 90% of the wealth, and when the 90% of the people that are left have the rest of the percent, this just isn't adding up to me. And you are, and the Wall Street Journal is so right-wing, so sure to downgrade, denigrate, do anything you can to smear Obama.
Leave it there.
Well, look, I urge you, ma'am, to read the book, The End of Prosperity. It's exactly about this subject. And I certainly, one of the things I want to be clear about the record is I work for the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal. We were very tough on George W. Bush, and we were some of the first people to say, look, George Bush is spending too much money. The budget is out of control. It really grew out of control after 2006 once you had Nancy Pelosi running Congress. But in the period 2001 to 2006, when Republicans ran everything, the budget ran out of control. And I agree with you, ma'am, that was a big problem for the Republicans. They started spending money like drunken sailors. I think that's one of the reasons that Republicans lost the Congress, because Americans felt betrayed that this party that believed in balanced budgets and limited government was spending so much money. The problem I have is, yes, we spent way too much money in 8 years of George Bush's presidency. Then Barack Obama comes in and he doubles up and he spends more money in the first 3 months than, for example, Ronald Reagan had in terms of debt in his 8 years in office. And I just think more debt and more spending is adding gasoline to the fire.
Last week in the Hill,